And welcome back into Still Enrolled. Of course, Ryan Hickey, Brian Tripp with you here. So last Wednesday was National Signing Day, and Tripp and I both were upfront with you. We're not exactly recruiting experts. We promised you we would get an expert on the show here, knows what the hell they're talking about, to break down everything from the Big Ten, talk about how your team did recruiting-wise, whether there's reason to believe in optimism, or maybe there should be a little bit of skepticism here as well. So we do welcome in Greg Smith. Does a great job covering college recruiting for Rivals, for Yahoo Sports. Greg, what's going on, man? How are you?
Hey, I'm doing well, man. It's finally a little bit of time where I can catch my breath a little bit. But as always, things are always still happening. So there's always something going on with college football recruiting. But I am doing well, hanging in there.
You're not wrong. Yeah, 24/7, 365 news cycle, to say the least.
Yeah.
I really like, Greg, your article you put on Yahoo Sports, where basically you gave a grade for every single Big Ten recruiting class for 2025. And so before we kind of dive into at least a few specifics, what I want to get into just overall, the SEC and the Big Ten, right, are the two major conferences, and usually the two conferences that are getting the most talent here. On the whole, when you kind of look at how the Big Ten did overall, would you say that they're getting the talent that a lot of these big time programs that they should be getting? Would you say it was a pretty good overall recruiting class for the Big Ten?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I think that you'll see a lot of this talent that came in this year. You'll be seeing play prominent roles on Saturdays and then be off to the NFL in a few years, like Michigan, Ohio State, Oregon, those teams in particular, especially with the addition of Oregon into the league and what they've been able to do. They finished signing day with our number one ranked signing class. They just have a machine rolling up there with Dan Lanning. And I think that people have started joking about this, but it's kind of come true that Dan Lanning has turned them into kind of Georgia Northwest. And that's kind of, I think that was his blueprint. And he's done a good job of that. Ohio State did what they always do, right? And kind of loading up, especially at skill position talent, kind of led by our number one player in Tavian St. Clair, the quarterback. And then Michigan, which was as talked about of a team as anyone around the country to finish out the cycle. They've got to be thrilled with where they landed to finish this class as well. So yeah, overall, there's a lot of good talent coming in. And then there's teams like Wisconsin, Nebraska. I think both of those schools did very well too. Illinois got a little bit of a bump, I think, based on the season that they had on the football field, which is good to see because it doesn't always work out like that for schools like Illinois, because we see on the flip side with Indiana is that they haven't quite had that bump quite yet. But those other schools are doing a phenomenal job right now.
You mentioned the Oregon machine with Dan Lanning right now. What type of talent did it? Who stands out from the class? But also, we've talked about here on the podcast that this is now the gold standard for college football. The undefeated team during the regular season, the Big Ten champions, the number one team in the college football playoff, obviously translating over to recruiting. What is it about Oregon right now that has that machine rolling, as well as what's impressed you about their class in particular?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I hear this all the time from both players and parents and high school coaches, is that they just love Dan Lanning and that staff. Like, they love their ability to relate to kids. And I know that it comes up so often, and it did again this class, about, they've got Phil Knight behind them and they've got Nike NIL money and all of this. And yes, that is true. that is certainly a part of it. But another big part of it is really honestly how well that this staff relates, and honestly Dan Lanning's reputation as a relentless recruiter. And a really funny, kind of interesting story on that is when they had their bye week late in the season, you would normally be getting rested up and you're ready to kind of make this championship run. What did Dan Lanning and his staff do? They hosted recruits during the bye week, which is an unusual thing for teams to do in general, much less when they're in the middle of a championship run at the end of their season. When it comes to their class, I think the thing that stands out to me is that because they have to do this because where they're located, they have to recruit coast to coast. But not only do they recruit coast to coast, they landed 5 stars from Texas, Ohio, Nevada, and Alabama. So they're like all over the place when it comes to where they're plucking talent. They got the best receiver in the country in Decorian Moore to come from Texas up to Oregon. Then he made a July 4th announcement. They got our top safety in the country, Trey McNutt out of Ohio, who's a dynamic playmaker on the back end. Like, it's a really good class top to bottom. And Oregon is also one of those teams, after all of that every time we get to signing day, they're always a dangerous team to flip someone. And they did it again with Naeem Offord, the 5-star from Alabama, and they flipped him. So away from Ohio State, a conference foe. So yeah, they just do a tremendous job overall, both relating to kids and then Uncle Phil's Nike money comes in at the end.
It's fascinating to hear you talk, Greg, about like national recruiting, right? Oregon's done a great job of it. USC with Lincoln Riley's tried to do the same as well. You graded them as a B-, and it's interesting, right? They were able to get Jakeem Stewart out of Louisiana, 5-star kids. That's a big get for them. But then you also mentioned in your article, which I think is very accurate, and I think a fair criticism for Lincoln Riley is the fact that, well, of the top 15 players in California, 2 signed with Lincoln Riley at USC. When you look at USC and they recruit, like I think they are intentionally trying to go national here. For sustained success going forward and trying to get USC to where Lincoln Riley's trying to get them to, is that the best approach?
I do not think it's the best approach. I really don't. Like, and I totally agree with you. I do think that this is on purpose. It's a thing that I think in kind of talking to people around the sport and talking to some people on that staff, it's on purpose that they are trying to spread kind of the USC brand and say, hey, listen, we can pluck kids from everywhere. Everybody wants to be in LA. It's a kind of one of the glamour programs in the nation, which is true. And so, therefore, you can go and get a kid like Jakeem Stewart, who was a fantastic 5-star prospect out of Louisiana, and getting him away from LSU, it's just an enormous upset. Like, you just don't see that very often, right? A program from that far away being able to do that. But on the flip side, I don't think that you can make a living being in a situation where Alabama gets more blue chip talent out of California than USC does. Like, I just don't feel that is a sustainable model for them. And if you go back to kind of their glory years under Pete Carroll, those guys, what they did was they set up a fence around the state of California. If they wanted a kid in California, they were going to get him. And they had tremendous success doing that and then sprinkling in guys from around the country, right? I think their famous thing was always, if we're going to go to the other coast, if we're going to go to the East Coast, if we're going to go down to Florida, it's for a draft pick, right? Like, otherwise we need to be recruiting home. And I think that it'll be interesting to see how that plays out for Lincoln Riley and company. I don't love it. I think that their fans don't seem to either. I think they should be recruiting their home state a lot more, considering the powerhouse high school programs that are in that state.
We discussed so much with Luke Fickell at Wisconsin. We think the biggest problem is finding what the identity of the program is. Does that question get answered at all in the type of players that Wisconsin was able to get in this 2025 class? And you had them rated as a B. Like, with all the changing, with how much they've struggled, missing a bowl game for the first time in forever this year, how is Luke Fickell able to pull off still a pretty decent class? And does this class help him find his identity in Madison?
That is the $1 million question, because I think on one hand, I really, really like that class. That's why I gave them a B. I think that they've got a lot of really good, talented players. That defensive back group, I think, is very good. And I think that those guys are going to play a lot, and they're going to play early. They had a few defections from their team in the transfer portal, and I think that they'll be just fine with the defensive backs that are coming in, right? Jameer Scott out of Ohio is a really talented defensive back coming in. Cam Clark, a kid that they pulled out of Michigan out on the offensive line, a 4-star, I think is very good. And that kind of leads perfectly into this identity situation. I think that if there were more Cam Clarks in this class and they were getting closer to old school Wisconsin power football, I would feel better about where they were going. But we honestly don't know kind of what they're going to do moving forward. They just hired a new offensive coordinator, but, and I think Luke Fickell said that he wants to do more power stuff. He wants to run more. But my thing with Wisconsin is that it sounded nice in theory to say we're going to spread open the offense a little bit more, and we're still going to play the same elite defense that we've always played. That sounds great, except for when you realize that the recruiting base that they have, they just produce really good offensive linemen, and then you can find running backs that want to run behind those offensive linemen. So you get away from that, and you're trying to make sure that you have to pull wide receivers from these speed states to come to Wisconsin. That's a really tough sell. Like, it just is. And I think they ran into that and figured that out in these first couple of years. So I think that they'll get closer to their previous identity. And so TBD on whether or not this class actually gets them closer to their identity.
Kind of piggyback off that, Greg, it is interesting, right? Because in one hand, NIL and the transfer portal, you could argue you can get talent from anywhere and you can kind of do anything you want. And Luke Fickell tried, right, to bring a spread offense to Wisconsin. And now, like you just outlined, it's a lot harder than you think. Right. And it's also easier to turn around programs faster than ever, as we saw in the Big Ten here with Indiana, right? With Kirkston, boom, all of a sudden they're 11-1. Now they're in the playoff. And you talked about in the beginning here, you're disappointed with Indiana's class. You graded them as a C. When it comes to like recruiting in general, we could see turnarounds happen in the transfer portal quickly, right on the field.
Mhm.
How long does it take for that success to translate into recruiting success for a lot of these schools?
Yeah, if you don't have a school, if you don't have a coach that's like a big name that has already had a lot of success at the Power Four level, like it's hard to have that immediate impact. I think on the recruiting trail because it takes a couple of years to build those relationships with high school prospects and those high school coaches. And part of that is the difference in, we were joking about the never-ending cycle of recruiting because I'm already on to like the 2026 class. So that means that these coaches have been recruiting that 2026 class and in a lot of cases 27 already, right? So if you take a job, it just makes sense that you're going to be a little bit behind on where you need to be with recruiting those guys. So in the case of Indiana, I do think that they're going to have a nice bump next year. I think their 26 class will be better than their 25 class. Their 25 class will also probably have a couple of players that were underrated by us that end up being pretty good because that's also kind of in their history and their DNA to kind of find those players that are under the radar. But they have a lot of good buzz on the trail, like especially in the region, in the Midwest. Like a lot of kids are now looking at them a lot more than they ever have. Obviously, kids that were in their recruiting class that other teams were trying to poach. They have a defensive lineman, Tristan Abram, that Michigan was after. But as Indiana's season continued to go up and up, he said, hey, why do I need to go somewhere else? I can stick with Indiana. And so when you start to have that happen, that lets you know you're on the right track if you're Kirk Cignetti.
Greg, we have a lot of Penn State listeners to this podcast.
Okay.
I hosted a 5-hour National Signing Day live stream inside the Lash football building for James Franklin and Penn State.
Okay.
Their class bolstered by a couple of really good tight end commits late. Probably no surprise with how many tight ends they've produced.
Yeah.
In Andrew Olish, who actually flips from Michigan to Penn State after signing day, and Brian Kordovich. Not a spectacular class when you look at the rankings, but a lot of players with high ceilings for James Franklin. What was your impression of Penn State's class this year?
Yeah, I thought the same thing. I thought that they also, it was interesting when Penn State was one, and Notre Dame was like this too, where they raced off in the beginning of the recruiting class and had a lot of early commitments. And then guys that got really good early rankings that maybe slid a little bit. And then Penn State, like you said, they'll finish strong with those tight ends, both of which I really like. And I think that Penn State is a team that, I feel like often gets left out of kind of the tight end kind of discussion is when that always gets kind of brought up, but they're right there in the mix and they've produced a ton of good tight end talent. So to get both of those kids, and I like Kordovich a lot, it's kind of a sleeper in this class, and Olish is rated where he is for a reason. He's a good player. And so I do think that they have a lot of guys to me that are kind of more in that sleeper category that could kind of, get better as they get into college. I still wonder about them being able to get that kind of high-end talent, those guys that are instant impact players to kind of come to go there and then be able to play right away. That's kind of, to me, the one knock and the thing that kind of separates them and where Penn State is always in the recruiting rankings versus where you see kind of, at least this year, Michigan, Ohio State, and Oregon. That's the difference between those classes and Penn State's class.
Look at Minnesota, Greg. They were able to get some high-level talent. They got a 4-star quarterback, Jackson Collick. They got a 4-star outside linebacker, Emmanuel Carmo. You still had them, though, rated C-, despite kind of, maybe that high-end talent at the top. What was it about Minnesota's class that maybe left you a little underwhelmed?
Yeah, like both of those guys, I really like Carmo, and he's a guy, too, that got a lot of interest from other programs and stuck with Minnesota. Because I think that a lot of times, especially those guys on defense, and Coy Parrish was like this last year that joined their program and was sensational as a freshman. Those guys on defense can really develop. They do a great job. They get you ready for the NFL. So it's no surprise that he stuck with them. The thing that kind of bugs me, I guess, about their class, it's not very big. I think there's only like 11 or so guys in the class. They also are a program, though, that is very hard to grade because they won't have a ton of talent in the recruiting class or in the recruiting rankings, yet somehow they're always pretty good, right? Or even if they don't have a good season, there's someone that you don't want to play like late in your season when you're trying to, make a run or something. So it's kind of hard to judge them because what they do is they're very comfortable with this. They get players that are under the radar. They will stash them away for a couple of years. They'll develop the heck out of them, get them into the program and used to the culture there, get them rowing the boat, and then they'll be pretty good. Like it's just, but it makes it hard on the front end to evaluate their classes. It's just not very deep. And besides those top two guys, you don't see a lot of kind of can't miss guys that other teams wanted.
Greg, you're around it all the time, and it's really easy for, I think, any fan, media members to say, well, NIL, NIL, NIL. When you talk to high school parents and athletes, particularly the top ones, how much are their decisions truly based off of an NIL number?
So most, I don't want to say most, I would say a good number of them, especially when we're talking about the elite players. I think that the way I think about it is, and based off of talking to them, is that you guys, all of the schools that are battling for those elite kids are going to need to be in the same ballpark when it comes to NIL. If you're an outlier, even if you're a great program, you're, say, Georgia, and you're an outlier with, kind of what you're offering a kid versus, say, what an Oregon or a Michigan or Ohio State is offering, then the kid's not going to go there. Like, you need to at least be kind of in range with what those other schools are giving. Then it becomes a matter of, okay, what's the best fit for me? How do they do with, kind of developing my position for the NFL? Because getting ready for the NFL, I think, is still the dominant thing. I think that's still the number one thing that you hear. And even teams, because then even teams that don't have the same NIL war chest as others can say, hey, you just delay it, right? You're going to delay that bag. You're going to get it later when we develop you for the NFL. It just might not come right now, but we'll get you there eventually. They can say that. And so, yeah, it's a big deal, but I still think the NFL is the top thing. But there are always outliers too. There are becoming more and more prospects where we view them as kind of straight NIL deals too. That it's happening more.
When you talk about what is the range for a 5-star kid, blue chip, what are some of the numbers that you hear?
Quarterbacks, you can hear, 7 figures. So you can get up to, for quarterbacks. For top offensive tackles, you definitely get up there. You talk about a kid like David Sanders that we had a little bit of back and forth with at the end there, right? Like, Tennessee had him committed, and then all of a sudden he wasn't going to sign, and Ohio State's making the late push. That's a kid that I expect got over $1 million from Tennessee. So your elite guys are getting $1 million. Your really big time quarterbacks though are getting more than that. Your Bryce Underwoods, Dylan Raiola the year before that, like, those guys got, I fairly confidently say those guys got over $2 million per year. And so then it kind of trickles down from there, because then it depends kind of, a kid like DeCorian Moore from Texas, 5-star that went out to Oregon. I would suspect that he's getting in the 7 figures to go up to Oregon, being that elite of a player, and, such a big need for Oregon in this class to continue to reload that wide receiver position. And it becomes an issue too, if you're like in the case of Tennessee, battling for David Sanders with Ohio State, you can get into some bidding wars in these situations too, right? Tennessee needs that guy to be kind of the jewel and the focus point of that class, right? He's an elite player. But Ohio State needed him because Justin Fry, their offensive line coach, comes under fire often for not getting these elite talents on the offensive line. And the big knock on that program is they're not as tough in the trenches, right? So those situations are kind of fluid and can be really interesting when you dig into them, depending on the kid and which schools he's looking at.
You mentioned the big name Bryce Underwood, Greg. This is the last question for me, right? That was obviously his recruitment was very public and very discussed. He was at LSU a while. Michigan comes in with reportedly a huge offer. He stays home, now goes to Michigan. Obviously a huge get, NIL aside, for Sherrone Moore and this coaching staff going forward here. What kind of impact can that flip do for Michigan going forward here? Looking at 2026, 2027, when you get a huge quarterback like that to go to Michigan, what can that do momentum-wise here for future classes for the Wolverines?
It cannot be said how big that is for what they're going to do in the future, because Michigan is a team that can always recruit like the lines of scrimmage and then defensive players, right? But when it came, and then running backs, because they have a great running back history. But the two glaring holes were quarterback and wide receiver. They had done fine there. And, they obviously just had J.J. McCarthy, who was a former 5-star and then went in the NFL, the first-round pick to the Vikings. But traditionally, that's not what they do. To get a guy like Bryce Underwood, and then for him to be, he's such an electric recruit at quarterback. Obviously, all the things they had to do to get him, all the reports out there about, 10 million, 12 million over the course of his college career. And I do think that those are accurate. I do think that that's where he's going to end up falling in, kind of at a base of what we're looking at. But what that does is it allows other like skill position talent to say, man, he went there and I could go play with him. Maybe that is a great place to be, not only to play with him, but then Michigan is also a place, and because you guys know this because you cover the sport. It's a great school. B, it has awesome tradition and a great fan base, but you didn't necessarily have kids, say, from the South really looking at Michigan. That was just not a school that they were going to look at. And now when they give them another look, I think they're going to be really impressed. And I think it will actually be easier than people think for them to now get more elite talent to come to Ann Arbor and play up there. I think that it's a huge deal about them being able to flip him, not just what they can do on the field and how talented he is, but what he's going to bring behind him in terms of recruiting help and in the portal as well.
Greg, last one for me. How long is the National Signing Day? The first Wednesday of December. Like what's the perfect? What's the perfect? If there is a perfect way, how do you fix this? Where you shouldn't have a National Signing Day in the middle of championship week in college football. How do they fix it?
Yeah, I'm not sure why we needed to move it up. Like it was very chaotic. Like that's the best way to describe it. In fact, we got into it and I was like, oh yeah, we've got teams preparing for conference championships right now. How is, say, Dan Lanning able to do any of this while also getting ready for a Big Ten championship game? I still like the idea best that you maybe split these into, like, keep it with the old February and then add a summer date, like something like that. The problem, I think, with having the summer date and locking guys in is what's one of the big drivers when we get around December, those flips, right? All these flips that we just talked about and discussed. Bryce Underwood, does the Bryce Underwood situation happen if there was a summer signing period, or would he have already been signed to LSU? Now, if you're LSU, you're happy about that. If you're Michigan, you're like, okay, we like the situation as it played out. So yeah, I still think there need to be tweaks to that. And even with, like, if you don't want to do the summer thing, do we still need the February date? I think in our Rivals 250, I think there's only one kid that didn't sign in December. So like, I don't know, most prospects are signing, unless there's a coaching change, most prospects are signing in December anyway. So I don't know, something has to give though, in order to kind of even out this schedule a little bit more. But this solution was supposedly the one that was going to smooth things out a little bit, and we definitely didn't get that.
No, not at all. And common sense entering college football, Greg, it's asking a lot.
Don't hold your breath. But that's what keeps it exciting, right? But don't
You're
hold
right.
your breath.
The chaos does make it exciting. You're not wrong about that. Greg, thank you so much. You do a great job, obviously, covering recruiting for college football. You give us a great insight here in the Big Ten. Keep crushing. Really do appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it. Anytime.